Welcome back to the next section in our study of the history of the 19th century in the United States. When we left off, the United States had just gone through the 1820 Missouri Compromise, and our lesson there revolved around the idea that many new states had been formed. And in the time since the War of 1812, many of the tribes of Native Americans had been forced across the Mississippi, and the land that they used to live on had now been occupied by an ever increasing flow of people who were moving west. In this time between 1820 and the 1840s, a tremendous number of people started to settle in what is now what we call modern day Midwest. This movement westward not only increased the population in the states that had newly formed in this western area, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, etc., but it also brought about a change politically that the United States saw. After 1820, the U.S. began to go through a process of changing the way that people were allowed to vote. And by people, we meant only white males, because back at that point in time, only people who were white males were allowed to vote in the country. But before this time, only white males who owned land or could pay a very large tax were allowed to vote. And so one of the big changes that we see in the country moving forward from 1820 is the development of what we would now consider a giant political machine. In the 1820s, we begin to see that every state, one by one, begins to loosen up their restrictions on voting laws so that people who wouldn't have been able to vote before, meaning white males who did not have property, were suddenly allowed to vote. And this increased the voice and the number of people who were able to influence America's politics. Along with that came a big shift in the direction that the country was going to go. There was still the wealth and power that existed up in New England, and a lot of the people up there were, of course, still directed towards the idea of industrialization. Their focus was on the idea of making America an industrial powerhouse fueled by finance and capitalism. Now, down in the southern states, of course, we know that this was a more agricultural economy, and so their interests lie far more in maintaining slavery and continuing their cotton trade. That was the primary driver of their economy. But suddenly, now we begin to add a whole nother factor. Now, the influence of people who have moved into these western states comes to play in politics as well. And one of the big changes that we see is that in 1828, there's enough interest in this group to elect a man called Andrew Jackson. Now, we had already met Andrew Jackson as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, but when he came into politics, he came in as somewhat of an outsider to the traditional Washington sense of politicians and who had power at the time. Andrew Jackson was really put into place a lot more by voters in the West, more by the working class, definitely not by the elite. And one of the big changes that Andrew Jackson brought about and promoted was a change in banking and the way that the country would do their finances. So Andrew Jackson wanted to take down some of the establishment banking that existed in the United States at the time, and in fact ends up creating a very interesting situation that would eventually bring the U.S. in 1837 into a panic not unlike the many other panics that we have had in the history of the United States. This panic caused a financial collapse, a huge increase in unemployment, and generally shook up the economics of the entire country. So it's not the first time that we have been through this little process here of boom and bust in the United States. Now, one of the big things that Andrew Jackson also brought about, which might be considered one of the darkest stains on our history, was he put in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. In 1830, he created a system where all of the states to the east of the Mississippi were able to engage in treaties with the Native American tribes that lived there. These treaties were oftentimes a way of just forcing the Indians off of the lands that they occupied so that the U.S. could then sell them to settlers. These treaties resulted in all of these different tribes that had existed in this area, and of course signed many treaties before, to be forced all the way across into what would be known as Indian country. One of the most painful ones in our history would be known as the Trail of Tears, in which the Cherokee Nation, who had followed all the rules down in Georgia, were forced to march 1,000 miles or so off to Oklahoma, losing many of their people along the way to sickness and marauding, and was really kind of a sad period of our history as they had to give up their homeland, which was rich and incredibly valuable, and were forced into the dusty plains of Oklahoma. But this was the nature of what was called in America at this time manifest destiny. Manifest destiny was a belief that God had given these white settlers the right to expand across this new territory and pretty much take whatever they like. It was an interesting philosophy, and it dovetailed in with many of the other things that were happening in the United States around that time. In these mid-1800s, we see a tremendous development inside the United States that is directed towards different forms of religion. Now, the original colonists who had come over to New England brought with them their Protestant religion that the Church of England, of course, had established in the 1500s. So most of these people were really of English origin and therefore were Protestant. A lot of the people down in the South, there was still a very Protestant sort of approach to things, and a certain, what we would call this Protestant work ethic pervaded this entire region. As a lot of immigrants began to move into the United States, we begin to see a different group of religions come in and start to take place. With a huge influx of the Irish and Italians, suddenly we get a very sizable number of Catholics moving into the country as well. And the conflict between Catholic and Protestant once again reared up in the United States. But even more so, the U.S. began to explore a lot of other forms of religion and spirituality during this time. Groups like the Shakers, which were a small religion that basically believed in absolute celibacy for all of their members, which obviously doesn't make a religion last for a long time. The Shakers survived for a period of time, getting known for their incredible skill in making furniture. But of course, if you have a religion based on celibacy, then you're not really going to last forever. Another group that came about during this time was a group called the Oneida community. And the Oneida community were a bunch that actually practiced the direct opposite. They believed in a version of free love in which their members were allowed to not marry or be monogamous. So, two radically different perspectives on a similar kind of theme of religion. Another group, of course, that develops during this era, a man named Joseph Smith up in New York State, ends up saying that he has discovered golden tablets that have an ancient hieroglyphic language written on them that only he could read with his reading stones that he had. Now, he went to a group of followers and told them that what he had found was in fact the Book of Mormon. And in this, the Book of Mormon, he was able to translate what he told them was a new book of the Bible that explained a whole bunch of ways that a group of people had actually come during biblical times over to the United States and settled over there. The Mormons, after a number of interesting experiences, many of which were based on their belief in polygamy, or people marrying more than one person at once, the Mormons left New York, and they ended up moving to a number of different places in the country, including Nauvoo, Illinois, where Joseph Smith was killed. After being killed, the Mormons decided to flee Illinois and made their way all the way across the country, eventually settling at the Great Salt Lake in what would eventually become Utah. So there was a lot of very interesting things happening within the United States during this period of time. Now, what we're going to talk about today, though, is what was happening in this part of the country. Mexico had gained their independence in 1821 from Spain after a long, drawn out situation where Mexico went from supporting the Royalists to creating their own Mexican empire, as they called it, which was a replacement monarchy, and then eventually settling itself into a republic. All the way through this event was a very important figure for them, and his name was Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Santa Anna was an interesting man. Originally, he was a supporter of the monarchy, but then he changed his mind and became a supporter of those who wished to overthrow the Spanish monarchy. He was then a supporter of the Mexican Empire, and then was part of the group that overthrew that. He finally ended up serving a number of terms as president of the newly formed Republic of Mexico, and he was a strong general for the Mexican army during this period of time. Now, in this area, which was at that point called the Mexican province of Texas, Santa Anna and the Mexican government down in Mexico City had been seeing a problem developing over time. The Native American tribes of this area included the Comanche and in the western part of it, the Apache. The Comanches and the Apaches had been raiding extensively all of the little towns and villages in this region. It became a very, very dangerous place to live because of that. And so early on, the Mexicans actually invited a group of American settlers to come in and help settle in this province of Texas. And so a man named Stephen Austin and 300 families moved into this area from the United States, founding, of course, the city of Austin, Texas. Well, Austin and his group, while Santa Anna and the Mexicans had hoped that they would come in and create a buffer from the Comanches, defending themselves and therefore holding the Comanches at bay, instead, really Austin and the Americans who had moved in were trying to stay somewhat close to this region because they still had ties to Louisiana. Now, a lot of these settlers came in with the intention of carrying on the slavery that they had been accustomed to in their other southern states. Well, this is going to bring out a lot of conflict in the U.S. government, which is not wanting to see another new slave state forming. Well, Austin comes in and brings in his original families that were invited in. They were quickly followed by a huge number of other Americans who begin moving in and settling all throughout this region. The original intention of Mexico in bringing in a small group of settlers had found its way into a point where there were a huge number of illegal immigrants. And these illegal immigrants came in to Mexico and refused to speak the language, Spanish, and they refused to accustom themselves to the way that people live there. They kind of kept to themselves, maintained their own culture and their own language, which was met with resentment from the native people of that area, the Mexicans. Sound familiar? Now, all of these people came in, and as their numbers grew and grew, they were seen more and more as a potential threat to the powers that be down in the capital of Mexico City. Now, the conflicts that were beginning to develop would continue and start to build up into what would eventually be a declaration by these people that they were no longer part of Mexico, but they were now part of the Republic of Texas. So they essentially declared their independence from Mexico without the permission of the Mexican government themselves. Now, the Republic of Texas then asked the United States if they would annex them or take over and bring Texas into the United States. Well, when this was happening in 1838, the Mexican government made sure that the U.S. government knew that if they were to annex Texas, if they were to take this step, it would be considered a declaration of war. And so the United States government of that time refused to take that action and just simply allowed Texas and the Texians, as they were called at that time, to continue on with what they were doing. they took a hands-off approach. Well, their hands-off approach eventually led to a situation where a group of Texians had gotten into a conflict with the Mexicans and decided that because of their Declaration of Independence, they were going to stand up to the Mexican army. Santa Anna himself came up with the intention of suppressing this rebellion and returning Texas to Mexico. Well, a group of these Texians decided that they were going to make a stand and prevent Santa Anna and the Mexican army from coming in and taking over their newfound republic. The place that they decided to make their stand was an old mission building. Missions had been built throughout this entire region long ago by Catholic Spanish priests who were going out with the idea of founding a mission or a place where they could try and spread the Catholic religion. The mission buildings basically were all usually about 1 day's walk apart so that people could go from one to the next very easily and always have a safe place to stay. That's why in California there are so many missions that go up the coast, all of which have Spanish-sounding saint names, like San Diego, Santa Barbara, San Luis Obispo, San Francisco. All of these were originally missions that were built by Spanish missionaries. Now down here, there had been a mission in Texas built called the Alamo. And the Alamo had gone back and forth from being just a mission or a church-like building to somewhat of a fort where local people could gather and protect themselves in case local Comanche raids came through. The Comanches were still definitely a very dangerous and difficult group to deal with for the people who lived in this area, and they were quite frightening to anyone who had to deal with them. They were definitely a very tough and warlike people, and they were not afraid to come down in large numbers and raid towns, steal cattle, burn down buildings, etc. So the Alamo had been built for that purpose. Well, these Texians took over the Alamo knowing that Santa Anna and his army were coming. But they were not prepared for the size of the army that Santa Anna brought. And so the Alamo had this collection of very interesting characters that had gone down to defend it. One of them was named James Bowie. And James Bowie was this very colorful figure of the time who was still known for his giant knife that he carried with him, the Bowie knife. It was special designed for him, and it was a very large knife that he could fight with should he run out of bullets or other situations like that. Another man in the area who was not at the Alamo at the time, but who was very important in early Texian history, was a man named Sam Houston, who of course would lend his last name to the city of Houston, Texas. Also going down was another incredibly colorful figure of that era, a man who was a former U.S. congressman from the state of Tennessee, and his name was Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett had many stories and songs about him and was considered one of the great frontiersmen of the time. So here is this group of people, but they only numbered about 100 at that time of these Texians who had gone down to defend this place. Well, Santa Anna comes up with about 1,500 troops, and they station themselves right outside of the Alamo. Now, the Texians were doing a desperate job of trying to reach out and get support and get reinforcements. And a few did come. Davy Crockett was actually joining in a second group of reinforcements that came in, but he was there with about 60 people, so not exactly going to stop this army of 1,500. And then it got worse. As they laid siege to the Alamo, another group of Mexican soldiers came in, boosting their numbers to about 2,000, and then shortly after, another group came in. So by the time the siege was really well underway, there were close to 3,000 Mexican troops surrounding between 1 and 200 Texians. This obviously was not going to go very well. The siege started on a very, very cold morning, and these large numbers of Mexican soldiers attacked on March 6th. They had snuck through late in the night, and work their way so that they were right outside the walls of the Alamo. And so at dawn, the attack began. The Texians fought very hard. They're kind of have had many stories and songs, movies, television shows written about this event. They fought very bravely, but in the end, the numbers were simply too great, and the Alamo fell. Santa Anna, after defeating the Alamo, decided he was going to pursue this and started to drive his Mexican army deeper into this Republic of Texas, as they called it. Well, Sam Houston and the people who had heard about the Alamo, instead of fleeing, began to really develop this story as a rallying cry. In fact, eventually Texas's rallying cry would be, "Remember the Alamo." And so, when Santa Anna arrived, he expected to rout the Texians, retake his territory, and then return to his position in Mexico City. But instead, he ended up meeting a very enthusiastic army of Texians, none of which were really official, regular army soldiers. This was really a lot more of a glorified militia in some ways. But they very soundly defeated the Mexican army at the Battle of San Jacinto and in fact took Santa Anna captive. Sam Houston eventually let Santa Anna go, but that was the end of Santa Anna's ambition to hold on to that area, and he returned to essentially leave the Texians alone. Well, the Texians continued to push their case for a good long time with the United States and asked for admission to the Union. But again, that was still something that was regularly denied because they didn't want to increase the number of slave states in the South. Now, eventually, this would come to a head, and out of Washington, D.C., a new president, James Polk, would decide that he was a big believer in manifest destiny, and it was worth it to pursue this attack on Mexico that they knew would come when they admitted Texas into the Union. And so, Polk, along with Congress, brings Texas into the U.S. in 1845. By annexing, which means to basically take, they annexed the Republic of Texas. And by doing so, of course, Mexico said, well, we told you if you did that, we would be at war. And so the war began. The war went from 1845 until 1848, and it did not go well for Mexico. Not only did the area of Texas see a number of successful battles for the Americans, but the U.S. Navy then sailed down to a place called Veracruz and began an attack there. Eventually, the group from Veracruz would go in and take over Mexico City itself. All the way over here, though, in very important territory, all of California becomes a prize that the United States is definitely wanting to take. Where Texas and a lot of this territory was very dry and deserty, not necessarily the best farming country, not necessarily the best country in general, California was rich and was a very valuable thing that the United States would like to take over. The U.S. actually then comes in and takes over all of the area that was controlled by Mexico there and pushes their way down along the coastline. Some of the more difficult things for us to accept in our history is that during this period, including in a place in Mexico called Monterrey, the U.S. was so aggressive in the way that they treated the Mexicans that by going along and using their cannons off of their Navy ships, the U.S. were sailing along and just really blowing up entire villages on the countryside, regardless of who was there, whether they were combatants or not. In fact, the Mexican-American War for the U.S. military would be a point where we actually put into law rules of engagement, meaning we would not willingly kill civilians or take actions that we thought were going to really kill civilians in a way. We would try to keep our battles to the military of the people that we were fighting. In the end, the Mexican-American War, of course, ends with the United States defeating Mexico, and Mexico is forced to cede an enormous amount of land. Out of this, the U.S. would get California, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, a good chunk of Colorado, and Utah, as well as, of course, the original prize of Texas. So the Mexican American War ends, and as we get to about the mid century in the 1800s, we see that the U.S. has again expanded its territory by a huge amount.